Finance. I lead our team working on responsible mineral supply chains at the OECD Center for Responsible Business Conduct. It's a real privilege today to be hosting this session as part of the Paris Peace Forum. I'm going to briefly go over the running order of the session and a few housekeeping rules, and then we can dive right in. We're going to be focusing on a new report from Global Witness, AfriWatch, and the organization JATAM on critical minerals and community impacts, and how we manage this sector for a just transition and for more responsible mineral supply chains. I'll be moderating the session, and just to go through a bit of the running order, we're going to hear from the Deputy Director General of the Paris Peace Forum, Fabien Arat, first, who will provide some opening remarks. And then we're going to go over, we'll give the floor to Emily Stewart from Global Witness to give us a sneak peek of the report and the findings. And then we'll be turning it over to Emmanuel Pula, of course, a longtime stakeholder and participant in our Minerals Forum, to give us AfriWatch's and some local communities' perspective. And then we'll also be turning it over to Ibrahim Rahman to speak to especially some of the issues around local consent. And then I'll go through I'll give a few questions. I'll line up a few questions for the speakers, and then hopefully we'll have ample time for Q&A. On interpretation, we have French and English interpretation. You'll find your headsets most likely in a pouch just under the table in front of you. Sometimes these may be in the pouch on your seat. Channel 1 is for English speakers and channel 2 for French speakers. And I think without any further ado, I can turn it over to Fabien Arat, Deputy Director General of the Paris Peace Forum. Of course, a real privilege to be hosting this session with you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Good afternoon, everyone. I am, as Ben said, the Deputy Director of the Paris Peace Forum. As some of you may know, the Paris Peace Forum 7th edition is taking place today and was also taking place yesterday at the Palais de Chaillot, under the big theme, Wanted a Functional Global Order. So a big, ambitious program for people working on global governance. The mandate of the Paris Peace Forum is to strengthen global governance, to strengthen multilateralism, and to renovate the multilateral system by innovating in various methodologies and approaches, and bringing together coalitions of actions on various global challenges. So in the context of the Paris Peace Forum, we're having these two events today on conflict and minerals. And it's a topic that is very dear to me, very close to my heart, because I lived in the Congo for many years. And I followed particularly from the second regional war in Congo from 2001, the work of the UN panel on illegal exploitation of natural resources. So I know firsthand the link between conflict and mineral exploitation. Of course, now I just want to say a few words about the Paris Peace Forum's work on minerals. We established in 2024 a global council, the Global Council for Responsible Minerals. And this council is composed of 10 very high-level experts, personalities, and I think one of them is in the room today, Glenn Fufane, but also Matt June, Bruno Oberle, Isabella Teixeira, Kande Yumkela, and many others. And so the interesting part of the work they did in the last few months is to prepare a report with very strong recommendations that they are now presenting to COP29. So they are already in Baku now, and in the next few days, there will be a discussion on the report. And they have very strong recommendations, and I will not go into much detail on the recommendations because I don't want to unveil the report before they do. But very briefly, the approach that they are promoting is an approach of integration of various dimensions, including the climate dimension, the industrial dimension, and also the multilateral strategy to manage minerals. And I think they're going to call for a better governance, including an international agreement on how to manage resources better, and in particular, insisting on benefit sharing for everyone. And this is really at the core of what we do at the Paris Peace Forum. We try to encourage a North-South dialogue on some of these issues. And right now, this is really not happening, really missing in action. So this is going to be one of the big focuses of this report. We also had a discussion yesterday at the Palais Chaillot, 2 panel discussions on human rights and technological innovation, and also on geopolitics and conflict and minerals and the role that they play in conflict. Lastly, just to say a word about what we call the SCUP program at the Paris Peace Forum. Every year we have a call for projects, and we select a number of these projects to be mentored, to be scaled up. And for the second consecutive year, we selected Madini, which is a consortium of Congolese NGOs and international NGOs working precisely on this issue. And so we're very proud to have them in our community. So thank you so much to OECD for hosting this meeting. Thank you to Global Witness. Thank you to the Department of Peace Operation of the UN for organizing these meetings. We're very pleased to work together. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Fabienne. And of course, our own cooperation with the Paris Peace Forum. It's a partnership that we really value here at the OECD, especially as it goes to the heart of the premise and the aims of our own due diligence guidance for responsible mineral supply chains, not only to address harms and mitigate risks in the supply chain, but also to enable minerals and the energy transition to be a source of sustainable development in mineral producing countries. And I think without predetermining how the rest of the panel is going to go, I think we were really keen to host this because the report, as everyone here will see, I think hits on some really important intersections and really where due diligence kind of where the rubber meets the road, where there's contact with clear impacts, whether these are environmental, related to security risks at sites and adjoining communities, the voluntary principles for security and human rights, how do we protect environmental defenders, of course, community displacement, a lot of issues that often come together, tied to integrity risks, often go to the insufficient governance and safeguards in the sector. And I think it's worth pointing out that, and you do this in the report, that obviously these issues really weigh on social license to operate. And I think that's not just something that is an abstract concept in our view about. It's of course a very important normative expectation, but it's also a very concrete element to the energy transition, not only being just, but being viable. Because when we don't manage these risks, in a first instance, of course, communities pay the price, and that's intolerable. But it also means that the energy transition and responsible mining sector is unable to take root. And so I think that's an argument that we try to make also, so that this isn't just nice to have. It's essential. And I also, just to point out before we turn over to the panel, I think for us, from the OECD perspective on responsible mineral supply chains, we see the emergence of a lot of work on specific ESG technical expectations at mining sites. I think this is to be commended, but we can't survive, or we can't build on this progress without looking at the totality of the mining sector. So not only sites that actually have gone forward to try to attain certification or say are on the leading edge in terms of the way they're managing their sites. We need a whole of supply chain and a whole kind of mining ecosystem approach. And I think that's where continued strengthening of due diligence is required, because that means everyone along the supply chain, no matter where they're sourcing from, what their exposure is to the informal sector, to the small scale sector, they have work to do. They need to be involved in risk mitigation. They need to engage with their suppliers. And that's why, yeah, we're keen to keep attention on this issue, and so that we see compatibility and we see synergies between looking at specific site-based issues and looking at whole supply chain due diligence. So without further ado, yeah, I'd like to turn it over to Emily to, yeah, give us a window into your findings in the report.
There we go. Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you, Fabienne, for those introductions. It's delightful to see so many familiar faces here today, but it's great also to see a few of you who I don't recognize. So perhaps a few words on who Global Witness are, if you don't know us already. We're an organization that's been traditionally rooted in human rights. We have a real pedigree in terms of work on mineral supply chains. Many of you will know us from our work on the Kimberley process on diamonds, but we've also worked on supply chains for things like timber and so on. So we'd been working on human rights for a number of years until we really realized that the biggest threat to human rights was climate change. And so in the last few years, we've kind of shifted our focus away from some of our traditionally very human rights based work to really working on the nexus of climate change and human rights, which is how we landed on the campaign that I'm working on transition minerals, because this is where I feel like an awful lot of these things come together, not least how exactly we're going to do the transition and how we're going to make it just. And this is just one of these key issues, which if we don't get it right now, we won't get it right at all. With that said, we wanted to, why did we do this now? I think, first of all, grounding it in where we are, the timing for releasing this report couldn't be better for us, because obviously we have the Paris Peace Forum, which looks at preventing conflict and violence in our world. And this report shows that perhaps mining for these minerals is increasing in this time. But also this week, world leaders are heading to COP. And it was at COP16 when we first put our lines in the sand and said we need to massively increase the amount of renewables that we have in the world, that it kicked off what we're now seeing the ripple effects of in terms of a large geopolitical race for securing these minerals to make sure that this transition happens. And so with those two things happening at the same time, it felt like a great moment for us to finally quantify what we saw happening in the world and what we were anecdotally hearing from the partners that we were working with. So I don't think that the contents of this report will necessarily be a surprise to anybody in this room. I think anybody who has been working particularly with communities who are located in and around mining sites will have been hearing the anecdotal stories about conflict, violence and protests in those areas. But what we really wanted to be able to do was to put numbers on this and look at whether or not this was a trend that we could anticipate increasing in the coming years. So with that said, we have a few key findings that came out of this report. And I think, again, this won't be unfamiliar to many of you, but it was really important for us to be able to quantify this. So from the basket of transition minerals, which we all know is quite broad and defined differently in different areas, we chose to look at 4 key minerals: cobalt, copper, lithium, and nickel. And we decided to look at the top 10 producing countries for those 4 minerals, which gave us a picture of 19 countries to look at overall. And we decided to look at the data for those countries between 2021 and 2023, so a 3-year window. We used the Standard & Poor data to identify active mines in those countries for those 4 minerals. And we compared that against the ACLED database. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with ACLED, what ACLED does is it maps incidents of violence, conflict, etc., against using media reports. And that's important in terms of how our data kind of ran out, and I'll go into that. So our main finding was that over that 3 years, and again, we're only talking about 19 countries here, and the data picture isn't clear, there were 334 protests and violent events, so an average of 111 a year. So 4 minerals, 19 countries. a fair bit of violence and conflict happening. Separate to this, I should say that we also have an annual report that we release as an organisation called the Defenders Report, where we look at the killings of environmental and land defenders. And one of their findings was that the industry that was responsible for the most amount of killings for land environmental defenders last year was mining, at 25 deaths. So the picture sort of links up there. Key to this as well is that we looked using the Standard & Poor data at mine ownership. And what we found was that 90% of these incidents were happening in developing countries. Compare that with the ownership of the mines, where, depending on the mineral, about 71 to 80% of the mining companies were headquartered in either developed nations or high consumption nations. Why am I using that term? Because we cannot exclude China from this data. And obviously, the IMF would not class them as a developed country, but they are incredibly important in terms of this picture. And so we term them as a high consumption country in this data. I mentioned that there are some gaps in the data, and actually I feel like this is a feature rather than a bug, because it tells us some really interesting things. Using the ACLED data, we're using data that's available to us because of media reports. And what we found was, for example, Russia, which is the world's 4th largest nickel producer, had no incidents in the ACLED database. Now, I think it's probably quite doubtful that there was no incidents whatsoever in the entire of Russia related to nickel mining, but much more likely that it tells us something about media freedom. And when I look at the results as well, I think one of the surprises for me is actually how few reports we have in DRC. Despite the fact that cobalt and DRC are clearly linked in the data, there's fewer than you might expect, given the anecdotal nature of the evidence that we often hear from this region, that this is an industry which is massively driving violence, conflict, and protests. And maybe a little word on the terminology here as well. We're talking about conflict, but perhaps not in the same sense that one might look at conflict in the OECD sense, as again, we're taking these media reports, and so we're using certain terminology to be able to identify it. And the types of events are quite broad. So, and any kind of conflict that's associated with it. So that sometimes is protests, and those protests may be associated with harms that are being inflicted on the community, environmental harms or human rights harms. But some of the protest data that we saw, in fact, was a picture about workers protesting for higher wages. One of the big areas that we focus in on in New Caledonia, the protests there around nickel were to do with shutdowns and the loss of work. So it's quite a diverse picture that was emerging. Yes, here we go. Really key to the information that we're presenting here as well is that we mapped it alongside the projections for the increase in need for these 4 minerals. We use the Standard & Poor data and their projections. Clearly others are available, including the IEA, which is the one that we're probably mostly familiar with. But in any case, they all give us a very similar story. So for these 4 minerals, between 2021 and 2028, so actually, in fact, within the next 4 years, we're looking at potential increases for copper of 25%, cobalt 100%, lithium 300%, and nickel of 75%. And these forecasts are based not only on our current use projections, but also the future use projections. And again, there are other organizations doing different projections, and some of them are actually wildly more than this. And so the drivers for the jump in mining that we're likely to see are there. At this point, I'd like to invite you, you're very welcome to scan the QR code. It will also appear at the end of this presentation if you want another bite at this, but to say that the report itself is available on our website, but we've also developed an interactive tool, which you can use to have a look at the different incidents as we've mapped them around. So you can toggle between different minerals and different countries. And if you hover over those little red balls, each one of those is an incident that's taken place around a mine. So you can get a little bit more context about what types of incidents we're talking about, what those mean and where they're taking place. And as you'll see, we've got toggles here for Chile, DRC, Peru. It's really tiny in front of me here. So US, Russia, Indonesia, Zambia, Australia, and Canada for this particular mineral. And then for different minerals, you'll have different countries that you can take a look at there. So knowing what we know, that this is an issue that's really impacting the developing and mineral-rich nations in which the mines are located. What can we be doing about this picture moving forward? As Ben alluded to, this is a key issue for the transition, and frankly, whether or not it's going to happen. If we think about what exactly we're looking to use these minerals for, it's to create net zero technology, which will ideally save us from the worst effects of anthropogenic climate change. It seems rather pointless to me if we do that at the expense of half the world's population. So clearly this needs to be a project which is taking into account everybody's needs, and the full picture, that we don't result in sacrifice zones where we simply say that the need for climate change is so great that we must mine areas which are of great significance culturally or ecologically. There's not only that, but we also know that in terms of supply chain risks, having incidents like this represent a huge problem for the supply chain of these minerals, which we're hoping to build our net zero technologies from. And that's a problem for all of us, but it's also a problem for companies. Our report goes into a few details about different types of effects that are already happening in mining, but I think the most significant stat that we have is on the Labambas copper mine, which has seen 600 days of closure since it's opened in 2016 due to protests and violence around that area. And so it's really incumbent on companies to be thinking about how we prevent this sort of conflict up front. And in fact, this isn't the only thing that forces mine closures as well. We also know that, for example, legal cases can slow down or close mines for a while. So there's a question about the bottom line for a mining company here, but it's also important for the rest of us that these minerals are flowing through the supply chain and we're able to build the renewables that we need from it. There's also a question, and I think this speaks to this massive rise in demand about our consumption levels, which are simply unsustainable. And when I say our, I really am talking about the global north. It's very clear that the levels of use and demand for these minerals are really spiraling out of control, and they're not necessarily going to the project of saving the world from climate change. The majority of these minerals are still being used in these technologies, but at least a quarter of them are going towards our security needs and other types of needs. So there are industries that are also putting a high demand on these minerals and perhaps using the cover of the just transition to try and get their hands on these supply chains as quickly as possible. But the energy that's actually being produced by the renewables that are coming online, we also know is only just meeting our expanding energy needs in the global north and not the energy needs that are in existence. And so we're not even achieving the goal of phasing out fossil fuels. This is a problem. So in terms of what we can be doing, energy efficiency, sufficiency measures, they're not just good for this picture of decreasing the heat, the rising heat that's clearly happening around mining, but they're good for all of us. And at a time when, in particular, Europeans are looking at their energy consumption and their energy bills, and they're really struggling with the cost of living, this is something that could be a clear political win for all of us, driving down some of these expanding energy needs. But we also need to be thinking very clearly about how we distribute these resources and the renewables fairly around the world to make sure that we're supporting the ambitions for developing countries for their own energy matrix and their own development pathways. I alluded to this on the panel that I was in yesterday, but it's absolutely crazy for us to think that the global north could just replace all of our combustion engines with electric vehicles and then what? Export them to the global south, who will be very glad to have them, I'm sure, all of our secondhand vehicles, but also they will continue to pollute. So this has to be something that's done in global cooperation. And I'm very pleased to hear from Fabienne about the council and the work there, because I think that global governance on minerals is something that's sorely needed, and that this is a topic that simply can't be left to individual mining companies to self-certificate or set their own standards for, to individual countries. But this is much bigger than all of us, clearly, and this is clearly an issue of global governance. So on that point, again, you have the QR code for the report there. We'll be handing over shortly to Emmanuel, who cooperated on this report. As I say, we've got the individual incidents here, but we were very pleased to be able to work with our longtime associates in AfriWatch and JATAM to flesh out some of the real life stories about what this actually means on the ground. So please do take a look at the interactive tool, and I believe we'll have a question and answer session afterwards. But
Great, thanks so much, Emily. Yeah, and maybe just break up the panel a little bit to get us started with one question coming your way. Obviously, I think even in the report, there are quite a few recommendations on what you believe, kind of the collective we can do to address some of these challenges. And also, I think it's great for all of us to take note of the tool that you mentioned. I think we do need more data and more consultation of data so that companies throughout the supply chain can identify the risks and develop plans to mitigate them together. But what do you think the first kind of one or two priorities would be for companies on the one hand, policymakers on the other, to kind of push the needle in this regard?
There's certainly a question about timing, because quite often the solutions that we want to put in place, some of them really take time, not least for the mining industry, where actually setting up a new mine can take up to 15 years. And so in terms of improving the conditions, it has to start today. It's extremely urgent that this starts today. But if you are a mining company, I very much hope that the takeaway that you'll take from seeing data like this is that there are a few key things that you can be putting in place from day one to improve the situation, which will have a tangible result not only on the security of the supply chains, but also your bottom line if the mining is to be more sustainable. And those are to very much front load community consultation and consent, and to front load environmental impact assessments, because if you put those in place, and those should be processes that they take as long as they take to get them right. But if you take your time over these processes up front, what ultimately happens is that you lose less time in the back end. Now, of course, I am referring to mining projects that do go ahead, and I should strongly say that Global Witness also supports the rights of communities to say no. So it's not always, go through the consultation process and say yes, but if you do have that community consent in place, then you know that it's going to be a smoother process on the back end of things. So I think that companies could be implementing this sort of in their operations as soon as possible, even existing operations. But then on the policy side of things, I think we are seeing some things happening in global policy, not least the European CSDDD supply chain due diligence regulation, which will start to move the needle on this. Particularly when we talk about how these supply chains look, clearly we know a lot of these minerals are either being mined by or moving through China. But a lot of the demand side of things is in the European Union and in the US. And so when the European Union puts in place a piece of regulation like this, it moves the entire market picture, because China has to respond, and China is responding. China is looking at putting in place their own due diligence guidelines, which will help companies in China make sure that the products that they want to sell in the EU are compliant to due diligence regulations in EU, so that they can continue to place their products on the market. So something like this really shows us how it can improve the overall picture, but it can't be left up to individual countries. And I very much hope that what we're going to see out of COP this week is that the recommendations of the Council will be taken forward, but that also the Secretary General's panel on transition minerals, which will be unveiled at COP tomorrow, I believe. It has a number of actionable recommendations. It's a pretty serious piece of text that we certainly welcome and see a lot of good things in there. And I think if this can be the basis for international cooperation on minerals, this would be a really good thing.
Okay. Thanks, Emily. Very, very practical recommendations. And we all, as you mentioned, there are the Chinese due diligence guidelines on mineral supply chains. And I think, like everywhere, we're keen to see a smart policy mix that can enable companies, create an enabling and supportive environment for due diligence. And I think, to be frank, we see implementation shortcomings everywhere. And the more traction we can get, I think policymakers could certainly help in that regard. And also, I think your point on front loading community consultation, I think that's a great point as well. Actually, we do have a sister instrument of the OECD due diligence guidance on responsible mineral supply chains, which is called the OECD due diligence guidance on meaningful stakeholder engagement in the extractive sector. So that's something I think that's increasingly relevant here. And it does set out that where there are expectations in communities for FPIC, that companies should take due regard of those expectations. And now I'd like to give the floor to Emmanuel to give us a view from the DRC, from local communities, and I think you'll give your intervention in French, Emmanuel. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you so much. I will switch into French so I can explain well my thought. Mon nom c'est Emmanuel Ompula. Je travaille pour AfriWatch, donc je suis très content d'être ici. Ah, ok. Je pense que... Ok. Donc, je suis très content d'être ici pour partager comment les communautés perçoivent la question de l'énergie, de la transition énergétique, parce que c'est une question qui est actuellement d'actualité, tout le monde en parle. Émilie vient de présenter un peu le rapport qui montre un peu les conclusions et les nombres de problèmes que les communautés rencontrent, les communautés qui vivent autour de ces minéraux rencontrent. Et même si le mot conflit pour certains minéraux ne peut pas s'appliquer de la même manière, comme les minéraux de cobalt et de cuivre dans le contexte des guerres, mais c'est plutôt les conflits liés aux problèmes entre la présence des entreprises et les droits des communautés. Le premier élément que je vais partager avec vous, c'est que quand vous êtes à Kolwezi, qui est, je dirais, la capitale mondiale du cobalt, mais aussi dans une ville où on produit aujourd'hui autour de 3 millions de cuivre, c'est que oui, on contribue pour la transition énergétique, on veut sauver la planète, mais est-ce que si vous arrivez à Kolwezi, vous pouvez trouver un véhicule électronique? La réponse est non. Je me rappelle, il y a eu 2 ans, je pense, une entreprise qui a amené à Kolwezi un véhicule électronique. C'était juste pour montrer aux communautés, voici à quoi ressemble une voiture électronique. Donc, c'était marrant parce que on amène un véhicule aux communautés qui détiennent les minéraux et que les communautés ne peuvent pas avoir accès, ni en termes de moyens pour acheter le véhicule, ni aussi en termes de possibilités, parce que même pour ceux ou celles qui ont des moyens ne peuvent pas l'acheter et l'utiliser à Kolwezi. Donc ça, c'est le premier problème. Et voilà, nos minéraux aident à sauver la planète, mais nous-mêmes, on ne peut pas, on ne peut pas les utiliser. Le deuxième problème, c'est que nous savons la question de l'énergie, de la transition énergétique, c'est une question derrière. Il y a des intérêts, il y a beaucoup d'argent. D'ailleurs, il y a un rapport qui a été publié cette année par Somo qui montre les profits que les grandes entreprises au Nord font derrière ces minéraux-là par rapport à l'argent qui reste localement. Et donc, on trouve qu'il y a un déséquilibre énorme entre les communautés qui disposent de ces minéraux et les profits qui est réalisé au Nord. C'est un débat, c'est une question qui doit être mise sur, la table pour voir comment on équilibre ces problèmes. Comment les pays qui détiennent ces minéraux peuvent aussi tirer profit de ces minéraux. Et je crois qu'il y a maintenant des débats qui viennent par rapport à cette question, c'est comment on se partage la chaîne de valeur. Aujourd'hui, la chaîne de valeur de ces minéraux profite beaucoup plus aux pays du Nord qu'aux pays du Sud. Comment on fait? Donc, c'est une question, c'est la perception des communautés par rapport à ça. Je sais que l'Union européenne, les États-Unis, tout le monde essaye de revenir sur la question, mais il n'y a pas de solution concrète que les gens proposent. Et il y a ces débats entre la Chine, l'Europe, les États-Unis. Actuellement, on dit, voilà, il y a Si vous êtes au Congo, vous trouverez que sur 19 entreprises minières qui sont au Congo, 15 sont entreprises chinoises. Donc, ça signifie, ça montre l'importance que la Chine revêt sur ces débats-là. La question, c'est, il y a beaucoup de violations, comme on l'a démontré. Mais le problème, c'est que si vous rentrez en arrière, vous trouverez la réponse à ces déséquilibres en termes de contrôle des minéraux. C'est que lorsque le secteur minier a été libéralisé en RDC, c'est plutôt les entreprises occidentales qui avaient les droits miniers. Presque tous les droits miniers étaient accordés aux entreprises occidentales. Et malheureusement, en 2017, à partir de 2007, on a vu que les entreprises occidentales se sont retirées tout bonnement de la RDC en vendant leurs actions aux entreprises chinoises qui proposaient plus d'argent. Et donc, on a vu les entreprises occidentales faire des grands profits en RDC sans investir, en laissant le travail d'exploiter directement aux Chinois. Et donc, ces contextes-là, souvent, on ne les prend pas en charge. Et la question, c'est, il y a beaucoup de violations des droits de l'homme actuellement, qu'est-ce qu'on fait? Et parfois, il y a des débats, est-ce que les Chinois sont mauvais ou ils sont bons? Et donc, la question, c'est de dire, mais comment on pouvait vendre les minéraux, les droits, sans consulter la RDC, sans donner les droits aux Congolais de dire non au fait qu'il ne fallait pas vendre les droits aux entreprises chinoises. Et que plus de 10 ans après, qu'on revienne sur la question et dire, est-ce que les Chinois sont bons ou ils sont mauvais? Et donc, c'est une question qui revient très souvent et aujourd'hui, on en parle. Mais pourquoi on en parle? C'est parce qu'on s'est rendu compte que la Chine contrôle ces minéraux aujourd'hui. Contrôle ces minéraux et c'est difficile pour les autres pays actuellement d'avoir accès à ces minéraux. Et donc, ça pose un problème pour les communautés. Le fait qu'il y a un seul pays qui domine. Mais la question, au jour d'aujourd'hui, quelle est la réponse qu'on propose? Nous avons vu l'Union européenne a développé sa régulation. On voit aujourd'hui avec toutes les politiques qui sont développées, mais personne ne vient nous dire comment on résout la question. Est-ce qu'on va investir pour avoir plus de réserves et investir? Est-ce qu'on va aider la RDC à avoir plus de technologies pour développer son écosystème au niveau local et permettre à équilibrer les déséquilibres? On n'a pas de réponse. Tout ce qu'on voit, c'est que les pays essayent de se battre pour voir qui va prendre la grande partie. Et là, les communautés qui sont autour de ces minéraux sont victimes parce qu'elles ne tirent pas profit. Et on assiste à un combat des géants où on a la Chine d'un côté, on a l'Occident de l'autre et les gens sont en train de se tirailler. Qui va prendre les gros morceaux? Et ça ne profite pas aux communautés. Donc, pour nous, au nom des communautés, pour que la transition énergétique soit juste et équitable, il y a des questions sur lesquelles il faut revenir. Et la première question, c'est comment on se partage la chaîne de valeur, comment, et parlant des chaînes de valeur, au final, ce qui revient, c'est nous sommes pauvres. Nous sommes pauvres parce qu'on ne profite pas des minéraux. Et quand vous arrivez, vous trouvez que les terres sont polluées. Si vous arrivez, parce qu'on a parlé juste de violence, mais vous trouvez que les gens ne peuvent plus faire les champs parce que les terres sont polluées. Les gens ne peuvent pas faire la pêche parce que les rivières sont polluées. Et l'air est pollué. Bref, vous avez tous ces problèmes-là qui empêchent les communautés d'avoir accès aux moyens économiques. Et en même temps, sur le plan des richesses que ces minéraux créent, les communautés ne tirent pas profit. Comment on discute de ces questions? Voilà un peu la perception des communautés. Oui, on veut sauver la planète. Oui, on veut sauver tout le monde. Mais à quel prix on va le faire? C'est la question à laquelle tout le monde devait répondre. Et comme je dis toujours, il faut avoir des discussions sincères et honnêtes. Malheureusement, de manière générale, les discussions ne sont ni sincères ni honnêtes. Tout le monde essaye de tirer profit. Et on trouve des demi-mesures. Tout ce qu'on dit, personnellement, quand on me dit due diligence, j'ai dit, mais on comprend, ça fait des années, c'est sur papier. discutons des questions de manière très claire. Comment le monde a besoin de minéraux. Vous pouvez demander aux entreprises de mettre tous les systèmes. En réalité, c'est uniquement pour avoir une conscience tranquille. Que voilà, nous avons publié un rapport. Si vous allez sur notre site, nous faisons ceci. Vous pouvez aller à l'est de la RDC. Quittons le cobalt. Ça fait des années qu'on met le système de traçabilité. Les gens sont pauvres. On se réunit dans... Moi, je viens ici à l'OCDE chaque année. Il n'y a absolument rien qui a changé. Il n'y a pas d'infrastructure, il n'y a pas de route. Et les gens se rencontrent ici, bien habillés, parlant des gens très pauvres, alors que ces gens-là n'ont besoin que de la paix, et c'est possible de le faire. S'il y avait la volonté, c'est possible qu'on arrête. Au lieu de se rencontrer à dépenser des millions d'argent, à se rencontrer ici. Donc, pour moi, je pense qu'il faut des discussions sincères et honnêtes. Et l'OCDE devait avancer. Tous les systèmes que l'OCDE nous a présentés jusque-là, ça ne donne pas les résultats. Les gens sont pauvres. Les gens n'ont rien. Si vous allez, prenez des Bukavu, partout là, toutes les mines là-bas, arrivez, vous allez trouver. J'ai rencontré un jeune avocat aux États-Unis qui a dit, il est en train de faire la documentation sur tous les projets qui ont été financés à l'Est. Et son idée, c'est attaquer en justice toutes les ONG qui ont eu de l'argent pour essayer de sauver la situation. Mais la réalité, c'est que toutes les solutions proposées jusque-là ont échoué. Donc, je peux m'arrêter là et on peut revenir sur les autres questions.
Merci beaucoup, Emmanuel. Et évidemment, ouais, il y a beaucoup de questions qui sont devenues peut-être encore plus aiguës, qui pèsent encore plus, étant donné l'échelle à laquelle la transition énergétique fait monter la demande en minerais. Je voudrais poser une question compte tenu de cette nouvelle optique. Peut-être ce n'est qu'une optique, peut-être c'est quelque chose de plus concret à propos de l'émergence des partenariats entre des pays qui s'approvisionnent en minerais en provenance de la RDC avec la RDC ou même avec d'autres pays producteurs. Est-ce que vous voyez dans ces partenariats un nouveau moyen pour inciter à une production, à un commerce responsable? Est-ce que ils peuvent offrir un nouvel élan pour la gouvernance minière et l'investissement responsable en RDC, selon votre avis?
Ah oui, en fait, on a salué, on a vu plusieurs, notamment l'Union européenne a signé plusieurs mémorandums d'entente avec les pays africains, notamment la RDC, le Rwanda, la Zambie, je pense, et d'autres pays. Et c'est en cours, ça va continuer. En fait, personnellement, je suis toujours optimiste, mais il arrive des fois, quand je vois les choses qui n'ont pas été bien préparées, je peux dire, bon, est-ce que ça va marcher? Je ne sais pas. Comme je vous ai dit, on est dans la logique où chaque personne essaie de tirer profit. C'est ça, en fait, la logique. Quand vous regardez, moi, j'ai posé la question en lisant tous les accords, mais vous regardez à l'intérieur, il n'y a pas, on nous a dit, voilà, on va développer une feuille de route, la société civile va participer. Aujourd'hui, la feuille de route est en train d'être élaborée, est presque finie d'après ce qu'on nous a dit. On n'a pas associé la société civile et donc on ne connaît pas les contenus. Donc, je ne peux pas dire que ça va nous apporter quelque chose sans y avoir participé. Et alors que nous avons écrit à la délégation de l'Union européenne à Kinshasa. Nous avons écrit l'année passée, cette année au mois de mai, nous étions ici. Nous sommes allés à Bruxelles pour dire, est-ce que nous pouvons avoir aussi accès aux documents? Il n'y a rien. Non, on va vous écrire. Et non, vous pouvez participer à ceci. Donc, pour nous, ça constitue un problème. Nous avons aussi demandé, est-ce que l'engagement, c'est de dire, on vient appuyer la chaîne de valeur au niveau local? Bon, on a dit non, non, nous on veut seulement appuyer la construction des corridors de l'hôpital et tout ça. Et je me dis, mais si on fait les rails, en réalité, on est dans la même logique, c'est de contrecarrer la Chine et de prendre les minéraux pour les sortir vers l'ouest et non pas trouver des solutions au niveau local. Donc, on est dans cette dynamique-là. qui n'est pas très claire. C'est vrai, la volonté qui est affichée, c'est de dire win-win. Ça, on le voit. Mais on attend la pratique pour voir est-ce que ce qui est proposé sera différent de ce que nous avons vu jusque-là.
Merci, Emmanuel. So the jury is still out, but we need to keep the pressure on. And I'm now going to turn the floor over to Iblin Rahman from the Surge Coalition to give us some of the perspective on the lithium triangle, regional tensions, and water scarcity. Over to you.
Thank you, Ben. ¿Alguien con un chai? Buenas tardes a todos y todas. Buenas tardes a todos y todas. Please don't be afraid, I'm not going to speak in Spanish. I'm going to use English.
Okay.
Thank you very much for having me here. And allow me please to start by paying my respects to the indigenous peoples on the ground, which voices I am bringing to this space, which normally do not have this space. And please also allow me to introduce you the SIRGE coalition. SIRGE stands for Securing Indigenous Peoples' Rights in the Green Economy. And our goal is to advance the rights of indigenous peoples, especially the right to self-determination and the right to free, prior, and informed consent. The report, of course, maybe a bit more on our coalition. We represent indigenous peoples from all 7 sociocultural regions of the world, where we are guided by these indigenous peoples leaders, and we have indigenous leaders, we have indigenous led organizations and indigenous allied organizations. We cooperate and we are part, for example, of the European Raw Materials Coalition, where we, together with the Global Witness, are very active in defending not only the environment, but also the people. The report of Global Witness, thank you so much, is very aligned and very close to our heart, of course, and something particularly, it's inequality. We touched already inequality, but inequality, it's not only one SDG, it's also, together with climate change and biodiversity, a driver for conflict. And at this meeting, we are talking about peace and conflict. So inequality is central to this discussion. And Paris and France is an exceptionally good place to have this discussion, because if we think about the French Revolution, we are going to see that inequalities are at the very core of what we human beings can stand or not. And we are, unfortunately, in the energy transition, pushing for a big divide, and we are creating even bigger inequalities on the 2 sides of the spectrum. Another point is risk. Risk is very much mentioned in the report, but for indigenous peoples, the energy transition is not a risk. It's a reality. Because if we see the definition of the Cambridge Dictionary, risk is a bad thing that maybe could happen. But no, it's not that. And I see in the discussion a kind of amnesia. It looks like mining is new because it's green, but it's no, and we have to be realistic. Mining is an old industry. It's making some efforts, and we see a lot of efforts of some companies to improve, a lot of efforts of investors trying to push the mining industry to improve, but we are not there. And we have to be clear, mining, we know mining, and that's a risk, and that's an opportunity, because we know the playbook. We know how it goes, we know what to do, we know what not to do. So to just illustrate risk and inequalities, let's please together make a trip. Let's travel into the Andean region. I come from Bolivia, Cochabamba, the most beautiful place. Don't ask me what I'm doing here. But if we go to the Andean place, we are going to be immediately, let's visit the lithium triangle. You know lithium triangle, you are familiar with it. Bolivia, Chile, Argentina. High, dry, warm. But this special place has evolved together with a specific, very specific, delicate, but well-adapted ecosystem. That's the wetlands, that's the water bodies that keep the ecosystem running in this region. There you find extremely specialized biodiversity, going from the very small, the microbes, the extremophilos, the phytoplankton, the zooplankton, I'm biologist, sorry, the phytoplankton, zooplankton. You have the rose flamingo, which is like the polar bear for the Arctics. It's an emblematic flagship species by which we can identify or we can show the importance of these water bodies. But these water bodies and the biodiversity could be also understood as the Amazon. They have a role in climate change because they are capturing carbon and they are keeping the water system for the animals, but also for the people. And the people which is living there for thousands of years, 11,000 years, is indigenous peoples mostly. And they have developed their cultures next to the water bodies, these water bodies. Now, we know that this area or these water bodies are very interesting in some composition. You find magnesium, you find sodium, you find lithium. Then it comes the lithium triangle. And this has attracted already the interest of many companies. Mining for lithium is not new, it's not going to start, it has started already some decades. So we know what could be improved and how we could guide the process to make it responsible. Sustainable does not exist. Please forget about sustainable mining, it does not exist. Forget about also green mining, does not exist. Let's go for responsible mining, which many people will still not agree, but still it shows what the Secretary General of the United Nations in its recommendations on the panel on critical energy transition minerals want to achieve. It's justice. Okay, let's go then to the lithium process. I don't know if you know, maybe you do, but please bear with me. The technician in me is speaking. Lithium extraction is a very water-intensive process. There are different methods, but the method in the Andes, in the lithium triangle, is taking huge areas of brine, evaporate this brine, and then get the lithium carbonate together with the other carbonates, and then at the end of the process, use fresh water. One test for you: how much brine water do we evaporate to obtain 1 ton of lithium carbonate? Please, an answer from the public will make me very happy, and we will make this presentation very much more interactive. Any idea? No? Yeah? Oh, well, thank you. No, okay. It's about 500,000 to 1 million liters of water, which is still very high because we have to think we are talking about the Andes, a water scarce region. It's desertic. If you go to Chile, it's the desert of Atacama, the driest region of the world. So, but not only the brine water, you also need fresh water, pure fresh water, drinkable water, 80 to 140,000 liters for the ton of lithium carbonate. So it's really, really, really water intensive. And here we come with a challenge, because for sustainable energy ambitions, we are hitting water scarce regions and affecting biodiversity, which is like the Amazon forest playing to capture the carbon and fighting against climate change. And also we are endangering the livelihoods of the indigenous peoples and the indigenous peoples there. So how can we go through a sustainable energy transition when we don't take into account the social sustainability and the environmental sustainability? Then we are talking only about the economic sustainability, and there we have to be attentive, because of course we want minerals for some purposes, and for the purposes we want, it's renewables. Okay, so what are the ecological? I was asked to talk a bit about ecological impacts and the social impacts. You know already, the ecological impacts is that the biodiversity and the ecosystems are going to collapse. We have proof. There is mining already there. We have, for example, the Phoenix project. It's a project which has been taking water from the Trapiche River. Finally, they said the water balance is not going to be affected in the environmental impact assessments, which is very common for environmental impact assessments there, if you find the information. And finally, the river just dried up. And the Trapiche Vega, which is a water surface, is dry. 32,000 hectares, no, 32 hectares, sorry, of water. Which consequences for animals, for the people, and for the water balance, because the less water we have to evaporate, the less water we are going to get back. Okay, what is the consequences on the social part? And then we enter into indigenous peoples. These indigenous peoples, the rights of these indigenous peoples are being violated. Because to begin with, these projects come without consent, not even consultation. Because the free, prior, and informed consent is a right of indigenous peoples. You know, free, you come without coercion. Prior, it happens before any decision is made on projects that are going to determine the quality of your life. Informed, you receive the information enough, and not 600 pages of an environmental impact assessment in English and in very technical terms. It should be culturally appropriate and you have enough time. And then you come to the consent part, where you give your yes maybe, or you no maybe. So FPIC is taken as a veto because they say FPIC means no, but actually it is not, because many indigenous communities are interested in developing because they are poor. They are very constrained. Their governments are not taking care of indigenous peoples. Sorry, I'm going to finish almost now. So it has been said about the demand and about the limits to our social and environmental consequences on the indigenous peoples. Now I bring the word risk, because until now we have seen this happening. Actually, indigenous peoples of the region, not only in Argentina, but Chile, Bolivia, Uruguay, Colombia, get together already 5 years for a water summit. And next year is going to be the summit of the Abiyala. Abiyala is the old name for Latin America, because they see this as a high priority. They see their impacts, their rights violated. But we have also to bring the risk here, and the risk does exist because of the lithium boom and the electrification process in wealthy countries. There is an enormous push to open new mines. There are explorations, and these explorations are coming with very or no real safeguards for the environment and for the people. The solution is very simple. First, please come to the indigenous peoples and respect their rights. This is not happening. Involve indigenous peoples in the conversation. This is not happening. The decisions, the projects, everything is happening. It's happening without their participation or respecting their rights. And what is more concerning, the legislation is changing. The legislation is changing not for the good, but for the bad. It's fast-tracking mining projects, and it's reducing the only instrument indigenous peoples have at the end, which is protest. They are criminalizing indigenous people's defenders, and that is happening now. We have to, on the demand, that's going to be my last point. We have come together as a society to a point in which we have to make some decisions. That is simply, there are very reputable studies that say there is simply not enough energy transition minerals to go through the transition we are projecting. Because in many wealthy countries, the energy transition is equal to an electrification project, where we change fossil fuel autos by electric autos, or electricity from fossil fuel sources to renewable. And again, we go to the indigenous peoples, because 54% of energy transition minerals are on indigenous peoples' territories, but also 1/4 of the earth is in the hands of indigenous peoples. And where do renewable projects like windmills or dams or solar panels come? It's again on indigenous people's lands and local affected communities. So we are suffering the problems of the climate change frontline, but also the solutions that are being put to the climate change. And we have to get serious and really ask, okay, there is not, it's science. Science is telling us there is simply not enough material for the dreams we have on going to electrifying our autos. We have to choose where we are going to put our materials, where we are going to mine, and we have to accept communities when they say no. And we have to go and work with the communities who say yes. And then when they say yes, then we can start talking about benefit sharing, not before. And benefit sharing is not a replacement of consent. We have worked with the panel of the United Nations Secretary General. We have been with the permanent forum there, and there is the tendency of saying, to make it just and to make it fair, we are going to go about benefit sharing. Yes, benefit sharing, yes, once we say yes, but not before. The first step is consent, and that is not a nice to have, because FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent for indigenous peoples, is the social license to operate. I will leave it there.
Thank you, Ebeline, for that rich presentation. I think since we're getting a bit short on time, I've received a couple of questions from the chat, from our virtual participants, and also as I get into some of those questions, maybe all those in the room here, you can start thinking about some questions you may have for the panelists as well. The first question is for Emily, and this question is, in your report or daily work, have you identified the availability of sound country laws, policies, and practices, especially in the global south, that promote responsible critical minerals mining and its related businesses?
No. No, but with caveats, in that the report doesn't do that. But they do exist, and there are sound policies. I think we should refer maybe to other minerals which have been being exploited for longer. Now, one of the reasons we chose copper as one of the 4 to look at is that clearly copper mining and processing is not a new industry, and therefore we had some quite rich material to draw on for copper. But I think we should cast our eyes back to some mineral supply chains which have been looked at for a long time, which we've been grappling with way before some of these transition minerals, to good practice. And in those, I think about the processes around diamonds and the processes around gold increasingly. So we hear about, for example, fingerprinting of gold, which could be something that we do in the future for various minerals, for the traceability elements for it. So there absolutely are good practices and examples that we can draw from. But I think that if you were to speak to somebody from, for example, Botswana, who has a lot of experience with the good laws around the governance for diamonds in Botswana, you might hear something a bit similar to what Emmanuel has been talking about, is that those laws exist. They have improved the situation in some ways, but the people are still poor. And so where those regulations do exist, there's still really big problems with enforcement around them, which is why I think it's incumbent for this to be a global project, because it can't just be us relying on either the goodwill of global north countries to do the due diligence and say, no, we're not going to source from here, nor should it be incumbent on countries which have sometimes big issues and capacity issues around being able to enforce or even create their own laws, This has to be something that we see as a global commons and therefore set global standards on and global expectations on mining companies, on investment, and yes, also on consumers. And if I might piggyback a thought that I had on this, because I've introduced consumers into this, I think it can be taken when we make these recommendations about resource use, efficiency and sufficiency, to think that we're asking for a world which is one that is less rich and less interesting than now, and that we all ought to be wearing hair shirts, not using mobile phones, and cycling everywhere. Cycling is good, but you know, you can't cycle on a summer holiday to the US, for example. That is not what this picture is. This picture, and I think this is the lesson that we should be taking from this moment, because actually this is a moment where we can change this. This is still a picture that we can influence. We know that we need mining for these minerals. We know that we need the renewables from these minerals, but how we decide to use them now is really, really crucial. And I've talked a bit about them being a global common, but they're also a community common. At the moment, we are largely putting them into these electric vehicles, which are inaccessible to the communities from where the minerals for them are mined, and may not be interesting for many communities who don't necessarily want to drive these SUVs around. We should be instead thinking very clearly in this moment about how we use these minerals to benefit the most amount of people. And that is not SUVs, but public transport. Perhaps the solar panel goes on community centres, on schools, rather than on individual homes. And I think it's so important that we present people with a vision where the mining for the processing, for the manufacturing of these minerals goes into something which benefits us all in a future that we can all be part of and interested in.
Thanks, Emily. It also goes to show you that this field, I think everything that we're after in terms of sustainable development is extremely varied in terms of discipline, in terms of different policy communities. And I would say, you know, certainly from a due diligence perspective on responsible business conduct, you know, not a panacea by any means. I think there's a lot more we have to do in that regard, but there's also in other policy communities as well in terms of responsible use of natural resources, responsible governance, and channeling those resources ultimately into economic diversification. It's a very wide playing field in terms of what needs to be accomplished there. Opening it up to questions from the room. I see Roland, you have your hand up. Maybe you can introduce yourself as well.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you for a really fascinating and important and necessary opportunity to have this conversation. Firstly, to start with Emily, to start by agreeing with Emily, I should say. We know we need mining. Yes, we do. And also to agree with Evelyn, I hope I say that right. Evelyn, responsible mining is certainly the way forward. If we're not going to not even drive bicycles, if we're just going to walk everywhere and live in caves like our ancestors, then frankly, if it's not grown, it's mined. You don't have to do mining the most destructive way. And in fact, despite the extremely passionate appeal we heard for the destructive nature of the lithium industry, actually the lithium industry is one of the least destructive and most high standards of all of the extractive industries, relatively speaking. I won't go into the technical errors of the processing, it's immaterial. But just to say that there are safeguards in opening a new mine. That's why it takes so many years. If mining was really quick and had no safeguards, then it would happen over the weekend, which is what, unfortunately, we see sometimes happening with artisanal mining, which I think we're discussing in the next panel. Artisanal mining is possibly, I won't get into the social side, but on the environmental side, it can be incredibly destructive. The large-scale industrial mining in OECD countries done to the IRMA standard is arguably the least destructive mining. And, you know, we all like phones, we all like to have not even electric cars, but we like fireworks, they use lithium. We like flying, aluminium alloys. We like driving a car or a bicycle. The grease within the wheel bearings of cars and bicycles, 70% of that is only possible because it's got lithium hydroxide in it. So,
sorry, Roland, just because I know there may be a few questions, if you could get to the question, thanks.
I think missing out on the opportunity in the lithium triangle. She mentioned she's from Bolivia. Bolivia is a really sad case study in how to get mining wrong, in that lithium mining in Bolivia doesn't actually happen. There's a huge opportunity there. If you look at the work of Daniela Sanchez Lopez, until the lithium was discovered, the salt pans of Uyuni was basically a desert and the communities were looking away from it. David Chokowanka, the vice president, when I was talking to him earlier this year, he in fact is an indigenous person, by the way. I said to him, what are you doing about the indigenous people? How are you getting them to be developing the lithium mine? He looked at me and said, look, I'm an indigenous person. My government is an indigenous government. We are doing this for the country. And by doing that, we raise everyone. We have the rising tide of economic benefit. And that goes without even touching on the £2 billion in taxes that SQM paid last year, or the $300 million that they share with the local communities in the Atacama Basin. And finally, my question to get to the point was, we don't need SUVs, we need micro transport, scooters, rickshaws, even one-wheeled, wonderful electric things we've seen whizzing around in Paris today. It doesn't have to be massive SUVs. It's not all F-150 Ford Lightnings. No, it is micro transport. And that is where anyone in the world, no matter how rich or poor, can benefit. And the question to the lady is, in the Atacama Basin, which is, after all, one of the four only functioning salars at the moment, what percentage, you asked your question about how much water, so back to you, what percentage of all fresh water in the Atacama Basin gets consumed by the lithium mining operations? Do you know? Let me tell you, 45% of water, fresh water, which isn't drinkable water, it's potentially drinkable water. It means there's not salt in the water. There could be shit in the water, but there's not salt in the water. That's what fresh water means. 45% of that water gets used by people, by farmers, by indigenous people, by tourists. The tourists who have swimming pools in a freaking...
Roland, if you don't have another question, I'd really like to open it up to the rest of the room. But I mean, appreciate the contribution. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentations and very interesting panel. My name is Irina Patrao. I work with a think tank in the Netherlands, based the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, on climate security and critical raw materials. And I was wondering if you, maybe if you had time in your research, look at this, or if you have experience with the link between violence related to critical raw materials extraction and climate-related security risks, because we know that mining affects water or soil quality. I'm wondering if you had any look at how the two risks sort of interrelate and if you have experience with that. Thank you.
Perhaps I'll kick off, and then I think Emmanuel's also got some thoughts on this potentially, and as well as Ibn. As I mentioned, if you look at the interactive map, what you can do is toggle over the individual incidents, and you'll see that the incidents are very diverse in terms of what's actually driving the protest and conflict. But we do see, particularly around the lithium triangle, that a number of the different protests and incidents that we see are indeed related to climate security. Now, whether or not the community sees it that way, I think is an interesting point, and it may not show up in the database in such a way because of that. For example, in the report, we talk about protests in the Jujuy province, I'm sorry if I pronounced that right, Jujuy province in Argentina, where we know that communities have been protesting against not necessarily the development of the lithium, but how it's been going about there. But for them, they're not protesting against lithium, they're protesting about the use of the water, which is a really, really precious resource for them and their way of life. So they won't necessarily be thinking about this in terms of climate change, but the fact that the water levels are already dropping, and that's the point, is the lithium's not being developed there yet, but the water levels are already dropping. And so they see that there's going to be competition for this already scarce water from the industry. So they're not necessarily seeing this in climate change terms, but the community who are there on the ground are best placed to see the immediate climate impacts and the climate associated risks for them. They may not verbalize it in that way, and it may not be presented in something like ACLED data in that way, but it's absolutely something that we see being a sort of comorbidity, if you like.
Oui, en fait, c'est une très bonne question. Et comme Émilie a dit, vraiment, il y a les liens directs entre les problèmes constatés et les changements climatiques. Il y a vraiment un lien direct. On a beaucoup de cas où des communautés ont manifesté parce que tout simplement, la nappe aquifère a été touchée, ils n'ont plus accès à l'eau, ou la rivière a été polluée, les sols aussi a été pollué, ou elles ne savent plus faire les champs, par exemple, elles ne peuvent plus rien faire parce que la terre est complètement polluée, suite aux acides qui viennent de la mine ou de l'entreprise vers les terres des communautés. Donc, les liens existent et on peut trouver, et parfois les gens pensent que les communautés sont contre les mines. Non, mais elles ne sont pas contre les mines, c'est par rapport aux impacts que ces mines apportent vis-à-vis de leur terre, vis-à-vis de leur vie quotidienne. Et donc, on voit qu'il y a beaucoup d'impacts négatifs sur les communautés et c'est ce qui fait que les communautés réagissent. Et on peut trouver plusieurs catégories comment les communautés réagissent par rapport à ces impacts-là. Ça peut être par la protestation, ça peut être par la violence directe. On a vu par moment les communautés attaquer le bien de l'entreprise parce que tout simplement, l'entreprise n'arrive pas à prendre des mesures pour protéger leurs terres. Ou l'État, de l'autre côté, qui a le mandat de protéger les communautés. Les services étatiques ne font pas leur travail pour protéger les communautés. Donc, on est dans cette situation-là. Et moi, je peux dire, les plus grands problèmes que nous avons, c'est la difficulté pour les services de l'État à faire appliquer les lois. Les lois sont là. Malheureusement, dans la pratique, on voit qu'on amène des solutions qui viennent d'ailleurs, qu'on veut faire appliquer sur le terrain, et très souvent, ça ne marche pas. Pourquoi? Parce qu'on veut remplacer ce qu'on trouve. Vous voyez? Et moi, dans mon expérience, on parle de traçabilité, on parle de ceci. Et quand vous trouvez dans tous ces systèmes-là, on ne tient pas compte de ce qu'on a trouvé. Si on a trouvé les codes miniers au niveau local qui parlent de traçabilité, quand on arrive, et c'est aussi la mauvaise pratique de nous comme ONG, parfois on est beaucoup plus guidé par les financements que par les besoins de résoudre, de trouver des solutions sur le terrain.
If I may, first to answer a bit the question there, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. Yes, we all like telephones, and yes, we all want to go on electric autos, but and there are definitely opportunities not only for lithium. I was asked to talk about lithium, but we can also talk about copper, nickel, and cobalt, and etc. But thank you so much because you brought a very important point, and that's about the sacrifice zones. We have to define, we all want, I have a telephone, but I have to be conscious that the materials for this 54%, there is a 54% chance that it has an indigenous people's face. And the opportunities are there, with free, prior, and informed consent, with the self-determination and involvement of indigenous peoples. Now, on the question of the link between the energy transition and the materials, and the energy transition and the materials for the energy transition for indigenous peoples, I can answer, and it's a yes. We have had an indigenous peoples summit now in October in Geneva, and there indigenous peoples leaders from all over the world, going from the Arctic to the south, came and say, we have a problem, and climate change and materials are actually are bringing for us an existential threat as cultures, as individuals also, but as cultures as well. And for us, I mean, for everybody, I think climate change and materials are two sides of the same coin. You cannot have the renewable technologies we want without the materials. And I want to bring the short term and the long term. If we do like Johan Rockström, the Anthropocene, the rock star of the Anthropocene, he said, if we do everything right in terms of climate change, go renewables, go electric autos, go everything, we will still fail if we don't take biodiversity into account. Because if we destroy our biodiversity, take the Amazon forest, to save the climate change, we are going to take a shortcut, but we are going to pay it very, very, very expensively. The Amazon, and science is very clear about that. You know that for the Amazon, they said if we go from 3 to 5 centigrades increase in temperature, the forest is going to go. And that was an important element. But the last science says it's not 3 to 5, it's 1.5, because you have to take into account the deforestation rate. And if this deforestation rate goes between 20 and 25%, then the whole Amazon will turn into a carbon capture to a carbon emitter, and they are going to enter into a savanna process that it's not going to be stopped. That's the long term and the short term. We really have to think systemic and long term and involving everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Evelyn. And I think we have time for at least one more question. I saw this hand first, and then I'll get you over there as well.
So first off, I would like to thank you all for your presentation and for this extremely interesting panel on an extremely important topic as well. So if you don't mind, I would like to ask my question in French. Donc, je me présente, je suis Mokhtar Lasri, je suis étudiant en Master 1 Sciences Po Paris et je suis également représentant du think tank étudiant Andalus Committee. Donc, ma question est destinée à Monsieur Mpoulin. Vous avez justement mentionné que les populations locales et les pays où on produit les minerais ne bénéficient que très peu des bénéfices de la production de ces minerais. Cependant, un argument qui est très souvent cité par les multinationales et les entreprises qui contrôlent cette industrie, c'est que ces entreprises apportent une expertise, et ils citent très souvent le fait, à raison ou à tort, je ne dis pas que c'est mon point de vue personnel, mais que ces pays-là ne disposent pas des technologies pour extraire ces minerais-là. Et donc, cela justifierait, selon eux, la place qu'ils s'accordent dans cette chaîne de valeur et qui justifierait la part importante des bénéfices dont ils disposent. Et donc, ma question, ce serait, quelle réponse vous apporterez à cette objection? Merci beaucoup.
If I could just start off by responding, because there was a recommendation in the report about this, and I think it's really important, especially because we're grounding this in COP this week. One of the other things that the Paris COP agreement asked for alongside the rollout of renewables was tech transfer, and that is often forgotten. It was just as important as the tech financing and bringing lots of renewables online, but it's just something that hasn't happened. And so until we give countries an opportunity to develop their own resource by having access to the IP and the tech that they need to improve, not only to just mine it, but also to have the absolute best possible technology to enable responsible mining, then we're always going to have an issue here. And I think it's a very conveniently forgotten part of the Paris Agreement. Now, of course, IP is complicated and you can't necessarily force companies to give that up, but there is plenty of IP that's owned at country level, particularly in China, which could be potentially transferred to developing nations.
Oui, en fait, c'est mon expérience en lisant plusieurs accords, plusieurs contrats. Vous allez trouver que beaucoup d'investissements suivent la tendance politique. La politique vient avant, après, les gens viennent investir. Et donc, quand vous lisez tous ces documents-là, vous trouverez qu'on parle parfois des transferts de technologies. Et même dans l'accord où les MOU, les différents MOU signés entre les pays africains et l'Union européenne, vous trouverez la partie transfert de technologies. Et c'est possible de le faire, mais c'est plutôt dans la pratique où les entreprises ne respectent pas ce qui est dit. Ou soit ce qui est dit n'est pas clairement dit en termes, permettez la tautologie, pour dire combien de gens on va former, après combien de temps on va transférer cette technologie pour que les nationaux puissent prendre les relais. Et donc, ça, ce n'est pas clair. Et quand vous descendez encore, vous trouverez que dans les codes du travail, par exemple, congolais, les mots transfert de technologie revient, n'est-ce pas? Mais c'est plutôt dans la pratique où cela n'est pas suivi. Je pense, c'est là où on pêche un peu, cela n'est pas suivi. Au-delà de ça, je pense que aussi au niveau des pays qui reçoivent ces investissements, ça devait être une des obligations. Mais aussi, ces pays devaient investir pour former des ingénieurs, pour envoyer les nationaux vers des formations appropriées par rapport aux besoins de l'industrie au jour d'aujourd'hui. Et c'est ça qui va permettre à ce que nous puissions tirer profit ou que la chaîne de valeur soit bien distribuée. Et je vais terminer en disant, ici, nous parlons des changements climatiques, qui est une thématique qui est beaucoup plus générale. Et tous on veut que ces changements climatiques, disons la transition énergétique soit juste et équitable. Et si on veut que ça soit juste et équitable, on doit insister sur cet aspect-là des transferts de technologies vers les pays du Sud.
If I can add to that, I agree totally with Emily and Emmanuel, but I also want to bring one element. It's not the technology transfer, it's with indigenous peoples is really respect, because let's think about Sweden. We have the Samis people there, and you cannot say Sweden is not a technologically advanced country. But still, the Sami people are being pushed at this moment by mining for the energy transition to a collapse. And they have denounced this, and they are on what they ask is again to the social technology, then the free prior, the respect for the consent. There we have consultation, and consultation is not equal to consent. And I want to bring this from the indigenous people's side's perspective. There does not exist a north and south, a wealthy, not wealthy divide for indigenous peoples. All indigenous peoples in the world are confronting the same thing. And it's not about benefit sharing or value added. It's the principle of respect. It's the principle of inequalities. It's the principle of justice and not creating conflict. It's the goal of the Secretary General, bringing justice, not only equity in very narrow terms.
Thank you, Evelyn. We have a couple more questions. I saw you first over there.
Hi, Sara Nicoletti, Resource Matters. So my question is mostly for the authors of the report, but then for whoever wants to give his take. Emily, at the beginning, you said so you use the word conflict a lot, but not in the classical sense. And my question is, why? Like, you have an audience who, by reading conflict, will think gold, tin, tungsten, tantalum. So my question is there like an intention to maybe bring the transition minerals conversation towards the conflict minerals conversation? It's quite a long-standing debate. It's been a while that there is a conversation about bringing cobalt in the group of the conflict minerals, and it's quite a controversial issue in Congo, like the whole conflict minerals narrative. So should we do that? Should we not do that? And is it something that informed the framing of this study? So the reason why you use the word conflict, even though we are not talking about conflict minerals.
I'm smiling because it may not be intentional, but it may well be subconscious, because my first kind of contact in my professional life with working on these issues was via the conflict minerals regulation when I was working in the European Parliament. And so it really influenced a lot of my own thinking about how mineral supply chains work. And also when we were trying to hash out what the definition of a conflict was for regulation, and what minerals we would focus on and which regions, and how terribly restrictive that basically the OECD guidance was kind of really restricted down into this regulation, into these small areas, and was not actually within sort of the spirit of what was intended by it, which was supposed to be much broader. So it's not an overt thing, but in fact, to be perfectly honest, the use of the word conflict and why I caveated it there is because most of the people here are probably specialists and will use this word conflict in terms of they'll be thinking of the Great Lakes regions and certain minerals and things, but actually the general public, when they think of conflict, they think of fights, arguments, disagreements. That's what this word means to most people. And I think that this report should be accessible to most people, because ultimately there is going to need to be a bit of a sea change in terms of how the public understands that there are some inherent issues and risks. Sorry to use that word again, because that might need some terminology workshopping as well. In the responses to the climate crisis. So I think it's very important that when we talk about conflicts, that actually this word to the general public encompasses quite a lot of different types of disagreements, violence, and that's reflected in the report's findings, that we used a few key words, but generally when the media was reporting on these things, they talk about conflicts, perhaps conflicts between the community and the mining industry, conflicts between lawyers and the industry, conflicts between government and community. It's a word that comes up a lot and it means a lot of different things to different people. And it really reflects the fact that we found that there was a huge amount of diversity in the types of, I could keep saying violence, protests, but actually conflict is a good catch-all term to most people for their understanding of it.
Thanks for that question. I think also, yeah, Evelyn. Sure.
I would like to add one more element.
Turn your mic on.
About conflict and defense. And here I'm going to refer to questions. Defense, we have talked a lot about renewables and that we want the smartphones and the autos and the electric bicycles, but how do we know which percentage of the minerals that are going to be mined under the number of the critical energy transition minerals are going to go to defense and bombs and wars? I was recently in a workshop working with the highly intellectual people modeling for the projections of how much minerals we actually need. And I asked this question: how do you know which percentage of in the demand of the minerals that we need, how much is for defense? No clarity, no answer. And there are some scientists, sorry, but okay, and once in the market, the minerals, how do we guarantee that our precious minerals that we are taking for energy transition are going to go for energy transition? Questions for you.
Yeah, very important questions, Evelyn. Thanks. Yeah, I see a hand right there.
Hi, I'm Elias Lucio. I did some work on illegal mineries in Colombia, and there is a big difference between actually conflict due to minerals and mining in conflict zones. And so how do you address the fact, how do you apply international regulation in places where there is actually no government and there's actually no structure to really even just evaluate the supply chain, because it's really happening.
I think with regards to Colombia, hopefully this is a situation that we're going to see changing, because we can see that the incumbent government is extremely interested in this issue, and in particular in the tracing of supply chains, because of the problems that Colombia has had around mining in conflict zones. You asked about specific regulations, and I think the whole panel has shown our hand that we think that this is something that needs to be answered at a global level as much as humanly possible, specifically because there are issues with governance and so on, and capacity in some countries. But perhaps to go back to the conflict minerals regulation and the OECD original guidance, there are some very good reasons to think that we should have added more resources and more definitions of conflict to that particular piece of regulation, that should have been much broader. And in Colombia in particular, I think there's an interesting picture emerging where there's been a lot of conflict driven by gangs mining illicitly for gold for a long time. And there seems to be a correlation now between the uptick in gang activity in places where transition minerals are rather than gold, which I believe the Colombian government are quite cognizant of and are trying to get on top of, but they are asking the international community to help them. And I think that we should answer that call at COP30.
Anyone else on the panel before we wrap up want to address that question? No? Okay, we'll have one last question.
Thanks so much. Hong Yuanyu from Shanghai Institute for International Studies. Actually, when we talk about this agenda, we have the lessons from Southeast Asia in 1960s to 1970s. At that time, most of the conflicts or even domestic war happening in the Indonesia or other Southeast Asian countries for these resource countries. But you can find that Japan and particularly uses such kind of the transfer or joint venture, transfer his technologies or infrastructure buildings for these countries. You can find that we have very good peacemaking or peace building in Southeast Asian countries, particularly since 1970s or 1980s, we can find economic miracles in Southeast Asian countries. So from this point of view, may I ask if China can work with EU or US or for this market to make such kind of huge investment in infrastructure building, just like 1970s Japan investment in Southeast Asia countries to make this conflicting area like to the currently you can find this new emerging power for Indonesia or these countries. And so, but we need the market upstream, midstream, and downstreams coordination, just like Japan, Southeast Asia, and the US EU market in 1980s. This also resource. This can we follow this model for make a game change for the infrastructure investment revolution in here in this resource country. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Professor Yu, I love this question because I think it offers us opportunities to think a little bit outside of the box and the paradigm that we're being presented with at the moment, geopolitically speaking, about solutions for the future and different ways of working across geopolitical lines, which look better, are more collaborative. And ultimately what we're talking about here is this report has shown there's a problem. We know there's a problem. There's a problem and there's conflict around mining sites. How do we make sure that we solve this problem moving forward and start to put things in place? And I do think there's a bit of a tendency, certainly on the European side, to talk up our achievements and our ESG and say, if you come and work with the Europeans instead of the Chinese, then things are going to be better. This is not the reality. The reality is that we have to see just how much China is a player. Obviously we've talked about the mining companies. Many of these are owned by Chinese companies. Similarly for the processing and a lot of the value addition. So China's a massive player here, and we've heard about the kinds of timescales for how long it takes to get mining online. So the EU coming in and saying, we're going to now set up all of these new mining companies and set up new mines, and they're going to have really high ESG standards, is just not realistic, not in the next 15 years, and that's optimistic. And so we have to work with China because they own the mining companies and they own the mines, and that's not going to change anytime soon. But I think we also have to recognize that China is interested in making steps in a lot of these areas. And yes, sometimes that's because of market pressures which exist with things like the CSDDD and the importance of being able to place your products on other markets. But in China, there is also a desire to have South-South cooperation, to have mutual development pathways. That does exist, and we need to recognize that. And if we only ever see China as a bad faith player, then we can't involve it in the conversation. And that just won't work when we're talking about the biggest player in all of this. And so perhaps to kind of maybe finish up on a point about conflicts, I often feel like we're in an area right now when we're talking about transition minerals that feels like a Cold War. The rhetoric coming out of the US and the EU and China about stockpiling minerals, all of these MOUs that are being signed, the rush and the heat of the conversation. I would love to see the heat dialed right down, and the recognition that this is not a business as usual scenario. These are not the new oil. These resources are precious. They have to be used sensitively. And they have to be used for the common good because it's literally a question of our survival. And so the sooner that world leaders get their head around this, the better. And I would love to see something like this because we have achieved it before. We've achieved it in the shadow of the world wars, and we've achieved it, as you say, in the 70s and 80s in Southeast Asia, and it's accomplished great things for many people. If we can treat minerals in this way again, then I think we could be on to quite a good thing, but the heat of the conversation needs to be turned down and fast.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah.
If I can close with a couple of words, thinking about where our host the Paris Peace Forum. Let's think about peace like a cake. What are the ingredients for this cake? And what is this cake going to be useful for? We have seen, I think there is no doubt that the participation of local affected communities, non-indigenous peoples, indigenous peoples is very important. It's a very important ingredient. It's recognized in the panel of the Secretary General. Benefit sharing is another important element. Using the best available technology, even if it's more expensive and leads to lower profits, it's also another part that we did not discuss. Daring to think where we are going to use our ingredients, if it's going to be for a cake which is going to fit our needs for fighting climate change and biodiversity and inequality, it's also important. So if we are going, and we need to all prepare this cake and we all need to share this cake. So my wish for the COP would be that our leaders come with this cake, taking the right ingredients and feeding all the crises that we have. And we are going to, with this peace cake, we are going to feed our needs and our hunger for solutions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Evelyn, and thanks everyone for your questions. I'm going to have to leave you quite abruptly, I think, because we need to set up the next panel. But I think clearly, besides some of the typical issues that we think about when it comes to sort of the specific risks and thinking of them in a discrete way, I think we've seen here really how they're all tied together. We can't take shortcuts. We have this spectrum of conflict that I think has come up, and we also see how conflicts can escalate when they're not properly managed. And I think some really clarion calls as well for dialing down the temperature as well. Of course, we can't speak on behalf of any of our members, and it's normal that there wouldn't be perfect alignment in diplomacy or geopolitics. But at the same time, I think we certainly see a lot of shared interests here when it comes to not only a stable supply of critical transition minerals, but a responsible supply that ends up building better partnerships and fostering smoother trade for the foreseeable future. Thanks. Yeah, and I would remind everyone, I think you've seen it on the agenda today, but the next session here focused on demobilization, disarmament, and artisanal and small-scale mining. That's beginning in less than 15 minutes now. So would invite you to take a brief stroll outside as we set that up, but please be back here promptly. Thank you.